So in this presentation, I want to talk a bit about the kind of relationship between fiction film and real life beliefs, and essentially try to make some headway towards a theory of that relationship. Now, coming from film studies, essentially it has to be said that perhaps the main disciplinary premise in text-oriented film studies, so film studies which is interested in specific films, is that first of all, clearly that fiction film is a privileged kind of object of inquiry in film studies, although of course there has been far more interest in documentary film, abstract film, animated film, and so forth. It is still the case that the bulk of scholarship is focused on fiction film. Now, the second point that I'm going to be, not arguing for, but assuming here, is that one of the key assumptions in film studies is essentially that fiction film changes real life beliefs. And I want to say that this is not only a matter of, a disciplinary situation, it is also an idea which is widely shared, I would argue, in the kind of a general cultural sphere. It's just, sufficient for you to turn to kind of a contemporary film criticism to see this idea that somehow, there's always this idea that if we are on a certain diet of certain fiction films, there will be certain kind of consequences for the society with this, because they do not represent a sufficient number of minorities, if they represent certain kind of groups of people in negative light. The idea is that this is bad, not only in itself, but because there are some kind of behavioral and primarily also consequences on people's minds and ideas. Now, another key facet of much of work in film studies, not here in this conference, but in general, that there is little interest in empirical work. So what I want to do here then in what follows is, first briefly kind of summarize this, what we can refer to as the fiction and belief problem, provide a brief overview of existing empirical research on the subject, provide some kind of a theoretical, outline some theoretical solutions and why might they not work, and then kind of circle back and say that in fact we might need a bit less theoretical work and more empirical work. So first of all, fiction belief problem. So as I assume a number of people here are familiar with, or at least this kind of intuitive level, the idea is, at least in much of kind of a film scholarship, is that, as here, for instance, a widely cited quote by Benjamin and Griffin say that images of people actively contribute to the ways in which people are understood and experienced in the real world. So to be a bit more technical here, what does that mean? Essentially, it means that representations, be they fictional, non-fictional, be they literary or filmic or other things, which are at least narrative ones, the idea is that these representations have narrative persuasion effects, i.e. that they influence audiences' attitudes, intentions, beliefs, and behaviors. What I will be mostly focusing here is beliefs, but it's clear how one can lead. Well, it is at least reasonable to think how one can lead from one to another. Now, when we think about non-fictional representations, so when we think about documentary, when we think about TV news, journalistic reports, my own account to you, for instance, that yesterday I went to the store, it seems sensible that these things will have persuasive effects on you. If I tell you something about what I did yesterday, the idea is that most likely I'm conveying some information to you which I want you to keep in mind, and most often interlocutor will do that. But when it comes to fictional representations, there seems to be a bit of a kind of a problem here, because prima facie, fiction is something that we take not to generate kind of beliefs, and something which is not to take to be influencing behaviors. So how exactly then do we square this with this kind of one of the key assumptions in film studies articulated here by Benjamin McGriffin? Now, perhaps we need to be first a bit clear about what types of beliefs we're talking about. So, because certainly, Benchoff and Griffin do not seem to specify this. What they seem to be focusing on is the third type of, let's call it a four-part division here. So one is, simply about perceptual facts, and that is essentially that, if we see a film which depicts an Eiffel Tower, the assumption might be that we can get some kind of beliefs about how Eiffel Tower looks like. Propositional facts, we might also have, for instance, the idea that Eiffel Tower is a building in France, in Paris. And then there is something that mostly what film scholars are kind of interested in. It is this kind of ideas about stereotypes, that certain depictions, either by omission or by explicit representation, will lead to kind of a furthering and kind of further entrenching of existing stereotypes about usual minorities or underrepresented groups. And also there is this kind of we might have beliefs about more generally how do, let's say, how does work operate as like an unjust place, a place of violence, a place where stereotypes are rampant, and so forth. Now, when we talk about empirical research, it is important to keep in mind that so a lot of these studies derive from media psychology, and also with kind of ideas relating to public health, where a lot of this work essentially was divided to figure out whether narrative as opposed to non-narrative forms of operation are kind of more effective in conveying certain kind of messages, what you should do, for instance, to take care of your health, not to smoke, avoid certain kind of risky behaviors, and so forth. So the idea was to check whether some kind of let's say, dry factual report is a better mechanism for conveying these ideas than, for instance, a narrative or a storyline or something like that. Now, the most recent narrative persuasion meta-analysis that at least I've been able to find is the one by Braddock and Dillard. And what they say is that narratives in general are really effective in generating this kind of narrative persuasions. And in fact, but when it comes to kind of fictional narratives, the results seem to be a bit more ambiguous, especially in the domain of beliefs, although it seems that they're pretty good for kind of attitudes, intentions, and even behaviors. Even fictional narratives are. It's unclear what the situation is about the beliefs. And in fact, not only is it unclear what the final result is, it is also the case that there is little distinction in this meta-analysis between different types of narratives. So, whether, for instance, literary narratives, stage narratives, audiovisual narratives, verbal narratives, which one of these is in fact more effective or not. And also, what is perhaps crucial for us here is that all of these things are essentially measuring for short-term effects. None of these things is discussing long-term effects. So something that we are probably genuinely interested. So it's not whether a half an hour or an hour after we've seen some film, we might have some ideas about what is represented there. Rather, whether, for instance, if we see a stereotypical film, whether this will lead us to hold for a while these certain kind of stereotypes about what is being depicted. Now, under the assumption that fiction films do generate real life beliefs, there have been kind of a number of solutions, and at the same time, number of criticism of the solutions, a number of failings of the solutions. So in film theory, again, there has been a lengthy history of ideas that this kind of a belief stems from some form of illusion. So this is something that Metz has been arguing for, and this is something that is very prevalent in apparatus theory. Now we don't have to go into details with this. Suffice it to say that a number of people have argued that illusion is really kind of an inappropriate term here. So you can't really talk about real life beliefs stemming from illusions, because strictly speaking, there is no relevant illusion there. And also, even kind of people who later on offered some kind of a more, let's say, up-to-date theories of psychoanalytical kind of influence theories, have argued that even ideas like disavowal, so this idea that at the same time we believe something and not believe something, so the idea that Metz floated was in operation during watching of fiction films. Alan has said that, well, this is really, again, inappropriate, because disavowal is really, let's say, a pathological psychological mechanism, and not something, and it's unlikely, that this would be a mechanism in operation for every viewing of a fiction film. Now, alternatives, exist in other domains as well to these, options to these solutions. For instance, in psychology, we find in work of Kahneman and Tversky this kind of idea that whatever is the freshest in the mind, so whatever is the most available is what is, what will be picked up as truthful. Now, of course, although this might kind of explain immediate effects of some kind of fiction films, we again have a problem with what we're really interested in, and these are this kind of a long-term effects. So if something is particularly vivid in the mind, by definition, these things will kind of fade as time goes by. So how do you secure this kind of applicability or availability heuristic for long-term effects if precisely things are, as time passes by, are no longer available or not as readily available. Now, other kind of theorists in this domain have in fact suggested that, contrary to this idea that was very popular, and it seems to be still have some currency in film studies, well, a lot of currency, and that and also in literary studies, that fiction is in a sense, well, in a vague sense, a willing suspension of disbelief. So what Coleridge has suggested in the early 19th century. Here, so many psychologists have argued, in fact, that it is just the other way around, that we by default believe everything, and then for specific things such as fiction, we, for one reason or another, construct, make ourselves disbelieve in them. So these would be the fictional things, things that we don't really believe. Now, of course, there are problems with this as well. And that is things like, figurative language, where the whole point of figurative language is that, you, before accepting something as factual, you already understand that it is metaphoric. So, for instance, when I say something like, I'm so hungry to eat a horse, it seems that the pragmatic reasoning, so this kind of metaphorical dimension of this sentence, already precede, this kind of, let's say, a factual flagging of the thing. So again, this would be an example why this type of kind of a solution would not work. Now, most recent, probably most interesting for us, is the work by Greg Curry, who has recently argued that among probably the most important mechanisms for accepting real life, so for accepting things presented as factual, is the matter of significant truth overlap with the factual world and author confidence. Now, in the first case, it is the case usually that that even the most imaginary of films assumes a certain kind of facts of this world as well. So even if we have a world populated by all types of fairies and werewolves and dragons, if there is still humans, the assumption is that humans are something like us. No? So another example, for instance, would be a matter of, if you remember, this kind of perceptual and propositional beliefs. So, for instance, in Independence Day, in a film which takes place, in the U.S., partly in Washington, the assumption is, that this kind of underlying information, such as, how the White House looks like before it's, of course, blown to smithereens, and how the propositional fact that is, the position that it is situated in Washington is something that can be, happily accepted as true. That would be kind of a Curry's idea. Another is that we also defer to the author, believing that she or he is generally right about things. So if if she is not, let's say, using particular elements, if particular elements are not crucial for the storyline, for instance, as is the character of the maid in Mildred Pierce, who is, as you're probably familiar, depicted in a very, very kind of a stereotypical and demeaning fashion. The idea is, because this is sort of a kind of a, just a background character, doesn't play a significant role. The idea is that the assumption is that this is, true, and therefore, this is another option, another kind of way in which kind of a stereotypes can be furthered. Now, of course, there are problems with this theory as well, as it always is. You can always find counterexamples. So just to kind of contribute my own kind of let's say critiques to this point. So, for instance, if we think about this significant truth overlap, there is a number of let's say parameters in the films which are not really relevant for the film, for its kind of which do not draw attention to themselves, which is sort of a kind of a baseline information, which are fall within these parameters of like world realism, as well as author kind of confidence, in the sense that we assume that the author is right if this is not so important for the storyline. But then this makes it problematic with how do we deal with a number of these films which depict ancient world here, Rome, yet regularly everybody speaks in English, and it doesn't seem to be the case that audiences jump to the conclusion that these ancient peoples did in fact speak English at the time. Nor it seems the case that audiences generally assume that your standard members of a ER clinic or or partners in a law firm are a kind of a model level looking people, though regularly American TV shows boast what could be easily said higher than average looking people. Yet again, the idea is, although this kind of good looks rarely play a role for kind of narrative purposes, it is the case, I would argue, that at the same time, this kind of presents a counter argument to this kind of author confidence, because again, to repeat, it is unlikely that people think that your average average board member or average suit in New York or wherever is such a good-looking person. And to kind of wrap this up, to remind us, in fact, that if all of this indeed is, to remind us that all of this indeed is operational on the assumption that real life beliefs do change, that fictional films do change real life beliefs, then what I would like to suggest is stepping back and really again checking this kind of checking this assumption. And one day to do it, and this is something that, for instance, Professor Ed Tan has been very helpful with, kind of coming up with the idea of how this could be kind of examined, for instance, is if we do a kind of a more representative studies which include far more than simply 15, 20 undergraduate students, but also try to be as kind of as representative as possible of the ages, groups, and what we're trying to do here is also try to replicate these studies as much as possible, whereas the whole kind of experimental design would be essentially either to, well, or it could be possible to do both. In one version, we show people a documentary film about tribe, a kind of indigenous tribe. In another one, we show a fictional film about a similar indigenous tribe, and then depending on what is represented in the film, we ask them over a longer period of time their beliefs about these specific groups, or about these specific indigenous kind of communities. And another version that can be also done is simply showing one and the same film. So for instance, we show the same documentary, First Contact, Lost Tribe of the Amazon, and then to one group we tell that this is a sort of a fiction film, documentary about this particular indigenous tribe. In the other, we say that it's documentary, and then we try to again gauge, not only for short term but also for long term, what is the status of beliefs regarding these kind of tribes. Thank you very much for your time. I'm looking forward to the discussion.